The biggest challenge facing the Caribbean is how to rebuild national economies battered by the COVID pandemic. Several Caribbean countries were enjoying growth and the prospect of reduced debt and improvements in critical sectors of their economies. All that changed within the first quarter of 2020, leaving the region in a quandary. In the September edition of the Caribbean Economic Forum, we assess how to adjust to the post-COVID-19 economy with a panel of international economists with Caribbean roots and experiences. Among them, Bahamian Dr. Peter Blair, Assistant Professor at Harvard University; Vincentian Dr. Wendell Samuel at the IMF; Guyanese Dr. Dylan Alleyne, Deputy Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC; and Dr. Eric Strobel, Professor in Environmental and Climate Economics, University of Bern, Switzerland, who has work experience across our region. I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, Jamaica, on behalf of our host, the Central Bank of Barbados, welcoming all on television, radio, and online to the September edition of the Caribbean Economic Forum. And a very good evening to you wherever you are across this Caribbean. And let's say a special welcome to our viewers in the United States and in Europe as well. And an extra special welcome for the very first time to Caribbean Times, joining us for this edition of the Caribbean Economic Forum. I'm in Kingston, Jamaica. My colleagues, of course, are all over the place. We'll be joining them as we look at this very important subject, the matter of how do we repair our economies in the wake of the impact of the pandemic caused by COVID-19. So let's go straight to our panelists, and let me first welcome a representative coming from, not from Guyana where he is born, but who is based in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and that's Dr. Dylan Alleyne, who is the Deputy Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America. We call it ECLAC, and he's been watching the situation across this region for some time now. Let's have him weigh in. So welcome to you, Dylan. And let's hear your point of view and your experience and observations about the situation now.
Thank you, Julian, and Trinidad and Tobago. It's wonderful opportunity to get this forum. The global environment is in difficult circumstances. Caribbean economies are no better off. As part of the responsible global community, we have sought to keep our people safe. We have helped businesses. We've done as much as we are able to address the immediate short-term impact. But we do that under circumstances with their fiscal stress. Fiscal stresses that began before the global crisis. A lot of debt to GDP ratio in the Caribbean is about 70%. And many countries have ratios in excess of 100% or close to 100%. And the issue is, how do we finance the immediate short-term needs and the longer-term needs? And there is some hope in that the Secretary General has been pursuing a process called Financing for Development, which will culminate on the 29th of this month. And that process, led by 6 groups, is designed to hopefully bring some liquidity to the region, which, as I say, is under enormous stress. And that liquidity may also be through SDR allocations and debt standstills, which we hope the G20 will extend to middle-income countries to embrace Caribbean states. And remember, we are all of this is happening in a very active hurricane season and in the context of climate change. So it's difficult for us, but I think we have to begin with clear planning and not be lulled into the belief that after COVID, the world will return to what it was. The world has changed, and the post-COVID world will be a different world, and we have to be prepared to adjust to that world.
That's a very interesting foundation upon which to lead off the discussion, because what you really said to us is, most importantly, that things are not going to be normal again, and therefore we must really seriously plan how we get out of this. Let me turn our attention then and give an opportunity to Dr. Peter Blair, who is Assistant Professor at Harvard University. He too is keeping tabs on what's happening right here at home in this Caribbean. Peter, Let's hear your viewpoint. I mean, you're watching, you're listening, you're studying. How do you see it?
Let's say a good afternoon to everybody that's tuning in from across the region, especially my family in the Bahamas. And I just want to say first and foremost that this is a very personal crisis, right? This is touching people's lives. We've had hundreds of thousands of folks across the world who have lost their lives. Just recently, one of my cousins died from COVID-19. And so this affects me very personally too. And what I want to say is that in the region, we're also reeling from the effects of Hurricane Dorian from last year, specifically in the Bahamas as well too. And so what COVID-19 is really doing is it's exposed some of the vulnerabilities of the ways in which our economies have historically been structured. And I think that this is a great moment amidst this global pause for us to really sit back and to reflect and to say, why do our countries exist? For whose benefit? How are they structured to assure the safety and the vitality and the growth of its own people? And so I think that amidst a lot of the crisis and the human aspect of this tragedy, there's a deep opportunity for us to reflect as individual countries and more broadly as regional partners in terms of coming up with national development plans and strategies for really advancing the future of the peoples of the Caribbean too. And so I see a lot of opportunity to really, in a sense, to start from zero and to really build up a stronger and more vibrant Caribbean community as well as individual nations.
All right, so at least you have a certain confidence in terms of your approach to this matter. Let me invite Eric Strobel, who is professor in environmental and climate economics, University of Bern in Switzerland. We've got him up very early in the morning, about 2 o'clock, where he is. But he can be forgiven, really, if he does hard time. But the fact is that he has seen Carnival in Trinidad. He's been there, lived there, worked there. He's been around this Caribbean. So I think he's very much in touch with what's happening. Particularly of interest is the fact that he has got a combination of interests. That is a focus on climate and a focus on tourism. That should really be of great interest to so many thousands of people across this Caribbean. Eric, let's hear from you now. You're watching, again, listening, and learning, so to speak. What do you see is our status?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me on the program. Yeah, I think, the biggest thing about this situation now, at least in the short term, is the kind of uncertainty that's around it. We don't really know how long it's going to last. We don't really know what things are going to be like afterwards. But having said that, and I think it's echoing what the other speakers to some extent already said, I think it's not something that the Caribbean has to essentially wait and see how the situation is going to develop. But I think to some extent, they can take it a little bit into their own hands. You know, we know that tourism probably is going to change in some way or other, whether that's, Europeans and Americans are going to want a little different kind of tourism or not. But I think to some extent the Caribbean can dictate that themselves. So I know there was a general feeling of unhappiness about how much benefits come from cruise tourism because they don't really buy local products. And I think if the Caribbean uses this opportunity to think about, what is the future? How do they want their tourism to look like, their industry, whether they want it to be more eco-friendly, whether they want people to buy more local products. And I think if Canadians came together and started trying to formulate a region-wide strategy so they can sit not individually against, let's say, cruise ship organizations who are going to be essentially going to be in a much weaker position to make any sort of demands here. I think they can take a real active role in trying to formulate the future, even given the uncertain times that we're in.
All right, so we at least recognize, and it's been talked about for a very long time, about this coordinated approach in terms of dealing with our tourist sector, making sure that we all operate as one. I think back to the CDO's campaign of One Caribbean across the United States. Let me bring then Dr. Wendell Samuel in here of the IMF, who's worked across several of the Caribbean territories. And the big question I always ask Wendell at a time like this is this a time where the IMF comes to our rescue?
Well, thanks very much, Julian, and good night to everyone listening across the Caribbean. The pandemic has created a significant difficulty across all Caribbean countries, and we expect that the effects are going to be long-lasting given the projected slow recovery in the global economy. However, in the midst of a crisis, there is always an opportunity, and I think the crisis has created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the countries to restructure their economies to achieve a more resilient future. In doing so, two key pillars are important: investment and regional integration. My sense is that governments will need to spend to keep the economies afloat, and wherever possible, they should try to spend on investment, because investment creates jobs, boosts local demand, and prepares the foundation for the recovery when it comes. And this is probably where the IMF can play some role, but the key for the region is that this has to be something that is internally led and done by policies that are created internally. So in terms of investment, I see three things that will be important: investment in sustainable agriculture to address the food insecurity that the region so much faces. The second is to strengthen the infrastructure to help build a digital economy with greater connectivity that would help to increase the productivity in the region. And the third is the investment in renewable energy to help reduce the dependence on imported oil and lower the cost of energy to tourism and other industries. Some of these initiatives would have to be pursued at the national level, but others require closer regional integration. For example, food security would require the removal of a number of trade restrictions across the region, and also to address the regional transportation issues. And one case in point would be a regional ferry to move goods and people across the countries, which the Caribbean Commission has put forward. What the IMF can do is to provide financing in some cases, but not all cases. And thank you, Julia.
Okay. All right. I think you yes. Go right ahead, Dylan.
A little surprised to hear how the IMF is going to help us. IMF short-term balance of payments support. And in the crisis, they have offered some liquidity, but the IMF doesn't have any business in what we're talking about, except that we run into problems. So, I mean, I get the spirit of the response, but I'm saying the IMF has had no history of coming into the region except when the region is in balance of payments difficulties. He's probably referring to the World Bank.
Wendell?
Well, sure. So the IMF has provided emergency assistance to, I think it's probably about 9 or 10 countries already and counting during this crisis. And my sense that there are some other countries that are probably going to need upper tranche, going to need programs that require conditionality from the IMF, and these are the sort of conditions in which the IMF usually enters, where you have a crisis and you have an issue related to the amount of resources that countries have available in order to meet their international obligations. So my sense is that in this crisis, the IMF has already helped a majority of Caribbean countries in providing emergency assistance, and some other countries are probably going to need that assistance down the road.
But we do have a situation, and you both can weigh in on this. When Dylan, you spoke earlier about the special drawing rights, for instance. I get the sense, though, that the level of stimulus that the governments are forced to provide now across sectors, which are more now described as very vulnerable, whether they will need far more than is available to them under that facility.
Oh, absolutely. Under the FFD process, there has been some discussion of reallocation of drawing rights, but the Americans have not been, and they require, they have veto powers. They have not been very willing to pursue this. But outside of the IMF, and I agree with Wendell, they offer some immediate support, but substantial IMF support only comes out of a stabilization program. And we've had a long history in the region with a negative engagement with the IMF. And we try to jump out of these programs as soon as possible. I think we are not there yet. I think there are lots of opportunities for us to pursue longer and medium-term strategies. And those, I think, should be on the table before we get to the IMF, outside of their rapid liquidity facility, which is an emergency facility. But those are small funds.
I just want to hold that point just a bit, and just to make a statement in regard to, say, the experience of Jamaica in recent times. Before COVID, Jamaica was literally a poster boy in terms of its relationships with the IMF. It come out of a very successful program after many programs over several decades, etc. And Jamaica, in fact, ending up with about $1 billion available to them, which they've not drawn down. So the IMF story is not all bad. Am I not right here, Wendell?
That is correct, and I think in recent years the IMF engagement with Caribbean countries have been generally positive. So there is the Jamaica program. There is also the current Barbados program that is currently being undertaken, and there is also the program in Grenada, and in recent times the IMF has provided resources and significant policy directions for some of the countries, and those programs have been largely successful. But the important thing about the IMF program is not that it provides all of the resources, but with the IMF program, they are able to get other donors and other countries to contribute to the success of the program.
All right. So in essence, then, if go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, it's a kind of distraction because Jamaica has been under several IMF programs and it has not grown significantly for 2 decades. Jamaica should never be seen as a success example. And I'm not saying that they didn't have to go to the IMF, but I'm saying that clearly is not an example to uphold. What they've done is that they've completed a program, if you call that a success. But Jamaica has not grown beyond 2% for 2 decades.
But before COVID, and I'll just stretch this as a little bit more, just to suggest that before COVID, the country had the greatest potential for growth. All of that now has gone by way of literally a hurricane blowing it away, so to speak.
Yes, well, we have to reassess where we are, and as I said earlier, to plan strategically to invest in those sectors, and I'll come to talk about that later, which will give us the greatest bang for the buck and to allow us to become more competitive.
Let me bring Eric back in here. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, if I can just
Eric.
Bring to the forefront. Sorry, Eric?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm an expert about these IMF programs, but I think success is something hard to measure, because success should really be, what would Jamaica have been without the IMF program? Right? I don't think it's the IMF's duty to ensure that Jamaica should grow 5, 8, 10% over the next years. It's just a matter, if it stays the way it was, let's say it's in a bad situation, or any Caribbean island, even during this crisis, are they better off with the IMF program or not? And I think that's the true measure of success, but unfortunately we can't really measure it. So I think one has to have some confidence in the program. And I'm no great proponent of the IMF. I know there's plenty of stories where certain programs were implemented in not necessarily the Caribbean that probably weren't suited to individual economies, but I think it's a difficult thing to gauge. And I think in situations like these, where clearly, at least in the short term, and it's not just the Caribbean, all developing countries are mostly need some sort of financing. It's the one thing that we at least globally have where at least money can flow relatively quickly.
Let me bring Peter in here, and I know you were trying to get in on this back and forth. So go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I appreciate the perspectives about the importance of international organizations to assist in this crisis. I think one of the things that's important to note is that COVID is unlike any other crisis that we've seen before, because it's a public health crisis that has metastasized into an economic crisis, which has also metastasized into a crisis of confidence in the ability of governments to literally keep people alive. So we're not just talking about having jobs, we're talking about providing basic health care, providing basic food and nutrition to folks. And so in a lot of ways, this is an opportunity for us to look inwards and to say, what are the systems that we've put in place? What are the institutions, the social structure, the very kind of social fabric that supports our economy, and that kind of gives a sense of meaning to like how we organize our economic system for the growth and prosperity of people. Just to bring in the US context as a point of reference, because people have been sitting at home watching their televisions, recognizing the enormity of this crisis, we've had deep, deep introspections about race relations in America. And I think in the same way in the Caribbean, this crisis is bringing to the fore income inequality. It's bringing to the fore inequality in terms of access to investment opportunities between folks who are native-born Caribbean residents and foreign investors. And while there is a role for institutions like the IMF to play, I think that there's a broader discussion that this crisis is forcing upon us to have in terms of how is our economy structured in a very fundamental way. And so we really need to take this huge pause that COVID is providing to take a deep look at how is our economy structured, what are the ways in which it's not working, and how has the COVID crisis really exposed some fundamental cracks in the foundation of our social fabric and our economic fabric as well.
So
But the reality is, yeah.
I totally agree with the point that Peter has just made. And that was essentially the point that I made at the beginning, that what COVID has provided us with is an opportunity to fundamentally restructure our economies. And that restructuring has to come from internal. That is, we as a region have to figure out what it is that we need to do in order to create a resilient economy. And the role of the IMF or World Bank or whichever institution has to be something that is one of the options that is available, and countries may or may not do that. But the fundamental thing, the fundamental dilemma that COVID-19 has provided for us is that it has given us an opportunity to restructure our economies in a way that makes these economies more resilient, less dependent on the international environment, and also give us a way to strengthen our regional integration.
Well, let's pick up what you're saying, Wendell, and let's see if we can get down to some specifics here. Because when you talk about restructuring the economies, the reality is that most of these countries really only have one thing to rely on, and that's tourism. Outside of Guyana and Belize and Jamaica, for instance, who will have mineral resources to turn to, we really don't have a lot of options in terms of diversification, for instance. One of the areas mentioned again and again has been agriculture, but look how long we've been trying to get agriculture to be the real diversified element in our economic mix. So where do we go? Because you talk as well about resilience here.
Well, I think we have to begin with where we are. Don't make, don't. We have to suggest solutions that are workable and are within the context of our own experience. We've not had a stellar record of economic restructuring. We have not had a stellar record of diversification. But I think that there is a way in which we could engage post-COVID by, first of all, developing an industrial policy that identifies sectors of interest. One of those sectors I would suggest is the domestic capital sector. That is really about building local capabilities through education and training. It means reforming our school system. And by the way, we spend as much on education as the OECD, so we're not getting value for money. Restructuring our education system to provide the export of global services. And clearly, while tourism will be with us for a long time, tourism will be very much restructured. So we have to invest in the domestic capital sector. We have to invest in education and health and make these sectors export activities. The North Atlantic, for example, has an aging population. We have a great opportunity to provide health services and also twinning that with tourism services. So there's a lot of work to do without requiring a great deal of new resources. We have to improve the investment climate. Much of this doesn't require a lot of money. And we have to do this also by expanding the entrepreneurial sector. Young people who have ideas should find opportunities to get capital to invest in those ideas. So there's a lot to be done, but it can't happen by just talking about it. There has to be clear plan. And ECLAC has suggested an industrial policy that embraces key priorities which the private sector could buy into.
All right, so at least you're talking about go ahead, Peter. We got about.
I want to chime in here for a bit. My apologies for interrupting you. It's important for us to realize that our region doesn't necessarily have a natural advantage when it comes to tourism. It was a deliberate strategy for us to become touristic countries. In the Bahamas, for example, which in some ways is a poster child for tourism, it was a deliberate strategy by one of our ministers of tourism in the 1960s to transform the Bahamas into this tourist mecca. Tourism used to be a seasonal industry. In fact, agriculture, sponging, fishing, those were the major industries. So we have to recognize that as a region, we've made very specific investments in tourism. We have recruited foreign investors to bring large mega resorts across the Caribbean. So tourism is a deliberate strategy. In the same way, we could have a deliberate strategy to diversify our economy. When we think about the reality of our economies, we do have lots of natural resources. In the Bahamas, there are some islands where we have 330 days of sunshine. Why should it not be the case that the world's major solar facility for making solar panels doesn't exist somewhere in the Caribbean? We should be manufacturing the world's best solar panels, right? In addition to that, we also have a tremendous amount of marine resources. We should be exporting fish. We should be exporting fisheries to folks around the world. And on a deeper level too, our greatest resource is our people.
Okay, we're going to come back after the break. Give you a chance. Give everybody a chance to weigh in on the tourism element, because I think it is really at the heart of some of the critical decisions we have to take. This is the Caribbean Economic Forum, the September edition.
solutions for common problems during this COVID situation. We fight it to protect our livelihood across the nation. This is for we to learn, share ideas and concerns, to live life like we deserve. We must change we mindset first. Build strong economies, closer societies. We all have a duty. CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum, who? Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum.
Visit www.centralbank.org.bb for more.
The next person in line, your friend at school or your coworker, may have COVID-19 and not know because they have no symptoms. You, on the other hand, could be hospitalized for 2 months or more if you become infected. Is it worth it? Stay socially connected, but keep the physical distance. Stay 6 feet away and avoid a hospital stay. COVID-19 is not over. Protect yourself while protecting others. A message from the Ministry of Health and Wellness.
Jamaica, home of the resilient, passionate and hard-working. A people and a nation who have achieved and defied all odds, working to keep their economy growing, their country thriving, from investments made in innovative opportunities and exports demanded globally. We have a vision, now within our grasp, where Jamaica becomes the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. We will not let go of this vision. We will grow. We will overcome these challenging times and look to the future with hope and positivity. These are special times. The world as we know it has changed, but home will always be in our hearts. And in Jamaica, you can always find a home. Think you know Jamaica? Look again. You will be surprised.
The point of wearing a mask is to prevent the spread of air droplets from persons who may or may.
I'm Julian Rogers, live in Kingston, Jamaica, and this is the Caribbean Economic Forum. We're talking about adjusting to the post-COVID-19 economy across our region, and we've got quite a panel ranging over this subject. Before we went to the break, we got into tourism as one of the areas that Peter raised as critical to development, where we go to next. I want to bring Eric in here because obviously the first thing people say is that we have thousands of people working in tourism. If there's no tourism, what happens to these people? What options do we have for them, etc.? So let's have Eric weigh in on this matter right now.
Yeah, it kind of ties in with what was just said before the break. It's not just a matter of what kind of natural resources a particular island has or not. It's all about comparative advantage. Where do you stand relative to other countries along the globe? So I think to suggest that one could maybe invest more into fisheries, there's two aspects to it. Could the Caribbean really compete in terms of prices and qualities? And then secondly, of course, if you're going to build up the fishing industry, there's competing uses for it. More fishing is going to mean less or more degrading of the natural resources, more fishing boats, and all these sort of things. So it gets a little bit more complicated in that regard. And I think in terms of tourism per se, it's not just a matter of that. It kind of went hand in hand. Individual destinations, this is not just in the Caribbean, started building up tourism because there was greater demand for it. As people had more money, as flights got cheaper and these things. So it gets a little more complicated in that. I think my perspective from the Caribbean, it's not going to be easy to diversify a lot from tourism, at least in the near future, except if for whatever reason the demand for tourism goes down. So I think the real question is, what do you want your tourism to be like? And I think with questions like how is the climate going to change, what is that going to mean for the region? And chances are very high that it's going to have some at least important implications. So sea level rise is going to mean that a lot of hotels are probably going to be in areas that are no longer sustainable. Degradation of the environment means that maybe these individual destinations are not going to be attractive as they were before. And lots of it, if we look at, for instance, at seagrass, doesn't really have necessarily to do with anything that was done locally. So these sort of things have to be taken into consideration. How do you want to build the tourism sector? And ultimately, And I think it all kind of interlinks here. How can you interlink that into other sectors? So if you can kind of convince both local people in the local tourism industry to buy local, let's say, agricultural products, to make that part of the image, Barbados essentially provides local agricultural products, then you can other sectors as well. And building the infrastructure, digital technology can all make everything more efficient. So I think that should be the sort of medium long-term view in this regard.
Peter, you're
Yeah, I mean, Eric, I want to respectfully disagree with your perspective. On the one hand, you can't say that we have a natural advantage in tourism, but then say that we don't have a natural advantage in fisheries. If you look at where like most of the spawning grounds for like 10% of the world's fisheries are, they exist in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, right? And so why is it that we could have some of the world's largest barrier reefs? Belize has the world's second largest barrier reef. The Bahamas has the world's third largest barrier reef. So these are huge spawning grounds for fisheries. We should be world-class experts in those sorts of things. And the contention that we can't diversify from tourism, I think is short-sighted. Because what would happen if a hurricane came and washed away all of our hotels? What would we do then? We would be forced to diversify. And the fact that we've had 9/11, we've had the Great Recession, and now we have COVID-19, if that's not enough to get us to start thinking about how we can move towards a diversified economy, I don't know what will be. And the last point that I want to make is that our investment in tourism is a deliberate strategy. We give away hundreds of millions of dollars in tax incentives to foreign investors to come to our shores to build hotels. Why can't we do the same thing for them to build medical facilities? I'll give you one very quick example. I think this must have been around 2006. The government of Singapore took $377 million and entered a partnership with Duke University to create a medical facility in Singapore. At the same time, the government of the Bahamas took a comparable amount of money, about $300 million, to invest in building roads. So it shows you where the priorities of our governments are in terms of investing. And so I really want to push back very stridently against this idea that somehow we're locked into tourism as the only strategy. We have chosen to invest in tourism, and we can choose to invest in other things. It takes strategy, it takes guts, and it takes vision.
Thank you, Peter. All right, before anybody else contributes here, we've got to take some of the feedback coming in from the audience. So we got a survey question out there. What's happening in terms of people's responses? So the big question here really is, and I'm trying to look at the survey question, which of these industries do you think will help us best rebuild our Caribbean economies? And the choices given to people were tourism, which tops the list along with agriculture, and the other one is renewable energy. The rest of the list, I have to point out, is digitization, and after that is financial services, followed by manufacturing, and way below is cultural industries, which surprises me because many governments have been talking about cultural industries as certainly one of those areas where we should not just diversify into, but we should be whole scale involved in that area. So what do you gentlemen think about that?
But let me say that we can't, the point of production is not producing what we like. We have to produce what the world wants. And the world is now on the brink of a fourth industrial revolution, characterized by innovation, characterized by knowledge generation, and characterized by digitization, which will be more intense after COVID. Are we going to stand by looking at these processes, or are we going to be investing in them? And I come back to the point, we have to invest in capability building. That will allow us to address climate change. It will allow us to address a more upgraded tourism. And what we want is not just employment, but decent jobs for our people. And the investment must be in capability building for global service exports. It may well be that these economies cannot absorb the range of skills and expertise that is generated, and which is why many of our young people emigrate. There are other reasons as well. So investing in capability building becomes a resilience strategy. And I go back to the point that we have to now picks up our schools. We have to create better outcomes at the level of schools. The differential in outcomes is far too large. And we have to also create not just schools for academics, but vocational training. So we account for all abilities. And we focus not only on science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but also focus on the arts, because the arts are converging with the science. And I think that that capability builds innovation. And there is where the world is going.
All right, see, you really, I'm trust we'll get an opportunity to focus on this matter of education as well as one of the options in terms of our future development and improving our economy. Let's go to a question which is coming from the audience as well. Let's see what the panel will be able to respond to. What is the best approach to an adjustment given the uncertainties that we have right now? I suspect that that is the overall question that we're addressing this evening. Let me bring Peter back in here, because you're smack dab in the Bahamas there. You're right on the doorstep of the United States, and you're seeing exactly what's happening across the border, so to speak, across that water border. We're looking here for confidence and competence at the same time, Peter?
Yeah, I think, to answer the question, my grandmother would always say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And so fundamentally, she's saying the same thing that the guys on Wall Street say, which is to diversify. We can't put all of our assets in the same basket. And so we have to diversify. Something that's important to recognize during this COVID is, like, some people have been hit incredibly hard, but some people have become billionaires many times over. So the stock for Amazon is through the roof. And so it's important to recognize that, in a sense, like, this new COVID future is creating winners and losers, and we get to choose which side of the ledger we're going to be on. And so we have to, as Dylan was saying, we have to recognize that the world is changing, and we have to change with the world. And innovation is certainly at the head of that. There's no reason why a company like Twitter could not have been founded in the Caribbean. In fact, Lyft was actually based on an idea of a guy going to Zimbabwe and seeing people do ride sharing in Zimbabwe. So he brought an idea from Africa to the United States, made billions of dollars, and then exported it back to Africa. So our culture, our way of being, has tremendous value. We just have to change the way that we see what it is that we do. And we have to recognize that not only is it good enough for us, but it's good enough for the world, that what we do is world class. And the moment that that mindset changes, we won't have an economic crisis in the Caribbean. We will be exporting culture. We will be creating technology. We will be creating new experiences. That really is going to position us for, like, this new global economy. That's my view.
All right, but let me ask you, all of you can weigh in on this. Really and truly, you're suggesting changes, dramatic changes in mindset, for instance, as you talk about, Peter. But is the problem that we are waiting for governments to act, as opposed to expecting that the entire populace will be mobilized to respond to this changed situation?
I'll say something very quickly on this. I think the government has a role to play. The government sets the ground rules. The government is a referee. And so the government has a role to play, and the private sector has a role to play as well, too. And we just have to figure out a way to really synchronize. How is it that the government can create a legislative environment and a fiscal environment that's going to allow businesses to thrive, right? And then once it provides that environment, then its role is more or less done, right? In this current crisis, too, the government also has to keep its eye on the public safety ball. How do you keep people safe? How are we going to get access to the types of treatments that we need to get access to like, make sure that people can work safely? That, in my mind, that's an appropriate role for the government.
I mean, I think...
I wanted to point to the issue of agriculture. So, as you can see from the responses to the survey, there's a significant portion of responses that said that agriculture should be the way forward, and I don't think that in agriculture people are waiting on the government. Because during the crisis, what we recognize is that everyone knew that there could be food insecurity, and everybody started planting food in their backyards. similar at a higher level. There are entrepreneurs in Barbados who are doing hydroponics, producing lettuce, fish, everything from hydroponics, using higher technology. And clearly, what that is saying to governments and saying to us is that food security is important, and that we ought to pay more attention to agriculture, not just for agriculture in itself, but to the extent to which agriculture can be an input into our tourism sector. The other issue that came up clearly in the context of COVID-19 is the need for a digital economy. So all of a sudden we have to do schools online, we have to do work online, and the question is, did we have the infrastructure in place to do that seamlessly? And we didn't. And going forward, what we need to do is to be able to build out that telecoms infrastructure, that would allow us to share in the benefits from being a digital economy.
Okay, let's go back to the audience here and pull up another question which has come in us. So let's look at that question now. Identify those world economies that may be similar to the Caribbean, which have demonstrated resilience, and identified these best practices which we should consider adopting. I suspect that, Peter, you already talked about the Singapore experience, and we've heard that for decades and decades as an option. But let's deal with the current situation. What practices would you think, Dylan, that we could look out as good examples and embrace them?
I'm sorry.
Dylan, did you pick me up? Would you go again, Dylan?
No, I said I was offline. I missed quite a few minutes.
Okay, sorry. All right. Well, let me then repeat the question that members of the public just now had to do with what world economies that may be similar to the Caribbean, which have demonstrated resilience, and please identify the best practices which we could consider adopting.
Well,
Dylan?
Julian, pick up on that, please.
Yeah.
So Julian, I was making a point about a digital economy, and I think one of the best economies that we can try to follow is Estonia. So the thing is that in Estonia they have adopted a fully digitalized economy, and in doing so, everything is done basically automatically. Your statistics are generated automatically. Your taxes are done automatically. Your social services, everything is there. And I think as small economies, that is one of the models that we can follow to develop a totally digital economy that would allow us to survive in a situation where there are lockdowns and giving us the ability to interface globally and share in those benefits.
Well,
All right. So that's certainly
the matter of
go ahead, Dylan.
digitalization is crucial. What we call e-governance is going to be critical. All government services over time should be online, and you could do that for also social security arrangements. You do that for the schools, for example, so that there's interconnection across all schools. COVID-19 has shown that quite a few children in all the countries in the Caribbean are not able to interconnect properly. Belize, for example, has many challenges, and elsewhere. So the inequality that has arisen is a challenge that we have to confront. Also, we have to monetize our oceans, and we have more ocean, more sea than land, and we have to find a way of using our resources in the oceans in a sustainable way. But that also requires capability building, which goes across the economy. You know, and may I say as well, there are a number of small economies which recognize that solidarity is something we haven't spoken about. There is a lot you could do from within, but you need solidarity to address certain external problems. For example, blacklisting and grey listing, and the issue of the loss of correspondent banking. Those are not issues that you could address merely at the internal level, and it arises because we are not at the international decision-making table. So I think it's, apart from regional integration, regional coordination, we also have to find solidarity with other groupings that could make our own case. And that is something which is very important. Very important.
I want to bring Eric in back here because I want to give him an opportunity to put an example on the table in response to a viewer's question. What example can we draw on and adopt?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things one has to realize is that that the Caribbean economies are small economies, so comparison should really be with countries that are like that. And I think one has to have a little bit of a view of what the future is going to look like. So if you look at a country like Luxembourg, which is one of the richest countries in Europe, it used to be, they were embedded in old steel industries. It was a relatively poor country by European standards. And then they just realized, well, okay, the banking industry was becoming more and more international, and they started investing. So having this sort of vision of, and they had a relatively high educated labor force of what the world probably may want in the future, and what your natural advantages are, then you have to make decisions accordingly, I think. I think in terms of digitalization, I think that's a very important point, but I think one can even take it further. I mean, even for the existing industries like agriculture, if you look at in parts of the US, farmers can buy into this technology where they're essentially through satellites can follow their crops at the 3-meter level, you know, minute to minute, and make decisions accordingly. So I think digitalization is not just a matter of in terms of digitalizing a government, but using digitalization to even make existing industries like tourism and agriculture much more efficient than what they are today, I think. So.
Thanks, Eric. All of you have made a reference to the matter of the requirement for the integration movement to be strengthened as part of that I would call it a task force, so to speak, in dealing with these economic challenges. And I want to bring Dylan back in here, and then Peter and Wendell for that matter, because Wendell was the one who raised the matter of integration at the heart of the response. Now, when you say integration in our Caribbean context, everybody, you know, a lot of people jump up and say CARICOM's not working. And then when you sit them down and you show them exactly that there are elements of CARICOM that are working, for instance, when we have hurricanes and so on, the agencies of the CARICOM community are mobilized, etc., but they don't see it as CARICOM. But let's talk about what is required now, because rather than have the leaders shouting across the border, so to speak, can we expect that the leaders will sit down and debate as one and act as one in this situation?
Well, the times are different. Regional integration is weak. We operate functionally, still have a university and CDB and so on, but there isn't a lot of stomach for strong regional integration, and there's a good reason for it. The reason is that the internal adjustment that is taking place is restricting trade and creating challenges within, and the political cost of ignoring domestic issues is great. But I think that there are opportunities. For example, we could have coordinated the opening of our economies at a regional level and to encourage internal tourism, for example. That's an opportunity. I think we could also move towards what I call regional integration so that people in communities across the Caribbean could combine their skills to produce goods and services. So and one area, and I think post-COVID, if we could reach there, it would be great, is free movement of Caribbean people. It means that you address labor shortages in one place versus another. People interact with each other, people acquire taste with each other, goods and services. And by the way, ordinary people are moving, but they are moving at great cost. And sometimes they're being exploited.
Okay, let's come back, Dylan, and give everybody an opportunity to expand a little bit more on this integration impact. But this is the Caribbean Economic Forum. We'll be right back with our panel.
Healthcare workers are working very hard to ensure lives are saved and people recover quickly from COVID-19. But their work is becoming harder because you're not wearing your mask, washing your hands with soap and water, or using hand sanitizer, and you are not maintaining physical distance. Let's limit the need for hospital beds and ventilators. Do the right thing. Cover your nose and mouth with a mask. Practice good hand hygiene and maintain a physical distance of 6 feet between you and others. COVID-19 is not over. Protect yourself while protecting others. A message from the Ministry of Health and Wellness.
This is our home, Jamaica, and tourism is the lifeblood of our country. Let's all feel good again. Whether with family or friends, we want you to enjoy your staycation.
We have to ensure that they are comfortable, they feel well protected.
New standards are in place to ensure your safety. We are here to serve you better, so you can have the best experience. Come out and rediscover Jamaica.
We are ready.
We are ready.
We are ready.
Rediscover Jamaica.
Heartbeat of the world.
Watch yourself online, that's what my crew say. Make it a new day. A reminder by the Broadcasting Commission. We the BCJ. What if it was your friend in the mix? What if it was your sis in the pics? What if you want a terrorist watch list? What if? Suppose that one. What you do? Don't like, don't comment, don't click. Report it, block it, don't make it stick. Don't trust everybody on the internet. Use it to step up your intellect. So online you have to be safe too. Don't believe the rumors or the fake news. Don't go everywhere they try to take you. Protect the kids or they find a way to. What if it was your friend in the mix? What if it was your sis in the pics? What if you want a terrorist watch list? What if? Suppose that go on. What if? Wait up, free.
Crime is Jamaica's #1 threat. As we stay apart while working together to fight COVID-19, we must all live good and unite against crime and violence in Jamaica. Live good means talk it out, don't fight it out. We must live good to build a safe Jamaica. Stay home, stay safe, live good.
COVID-19 is still here. Always wear your mask correctly while in public places, covering your nose and mouth at all times. Masks should never be worn over the head, under your chin, below your nose, or hanging from your ears. Recovery from COVID-19 can take up to 60 days or more. The mask or the ventilator?
It's the Caribbean Economic Forum. I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, Jamaica, with a panel around the world, so to speak. We're talking about integration as a tool, so to speak, to deal with the economic challenges that we're facing and to repair our economies in the wake of the pandemic caused by COVID-19. And before we went to the break, we did hear from one of the panelists about Dylan particularly talking about the way that he thought the CARICOM community, so to speak, could really drive this change. But let me ask Peter to weigh in on this because I'd be interested to hear from somebody from the Bahamas as far as the integration movement is concerned. Peter?
Yeah, and I'm proud to represent the Bahamas, and at the same time too to say that, you know, whenever I've traveled throughout the Caribbean, like I've always felt very welcomed, and I felt like a native son of the soil. I think that where integration has worked and we need to strengthen it is in terms of our university systems. So many of our countries export, we send our students to the US to get college educated. Me, I started university at the College of the Bahamas, so I know what it's like to be educated in the Caribbean. And I think that we should really strengthen our training systems at the university level. I think that there are opportunities for us to think about like transference of like skilled labor. But when you talk about the mass movement of people across space, I think that there are a lot of like socio-political and economic concerns that might raise. And undergirding this too is just the fact that it's really difficult to travel around the Caribbean. Whenever I have to go to Barbados, I have to fly from Nassau to Miami and then to Barbados. And so before we even begin to think, you know, about regional integration, we have to think about how do we get people to move within the Caribbean without having to first fly into the United States. I think that's really fundamental. The last thing that I'll say is that we can't look at regional integration as a panacea or a cure-all for some fundamental structural issues within each of our countries. We still have to do the deep internal work of saying what's wrong with the Bahamas, what's wrong with Jamaica, with Guyana, with Trinidad, with Barbados, and we have to fix that at a local level. Because if we layer on top of the brokenness of our society's regional integration, we're just going to compound some issues that are already there as well. And I think that that's something that we need to be a lot more kind of careful about how we think about doing that.
Okay, one of the solutions that Wendell put up very... Dylan, okay, I'll let Dylan go first and then I'll ask Wendell about the ferry situation. Go ahead.
There is a tendency in the Caribbean to think about government doing this and government doing that. And I think we've come to recognize that government is very limited, although it has a very important role to play. It's very limited in its capacity to get things done. And so what you need to do is to open the space. As I say, regional integration is about large numbers of people moving through the Caribbean safely, of course, interacting with each other, making deals, and so on. Why, for example, in the education system, a child from Barbados is not working with a child in Guyana, and so on. So regional integration must be integration of people as well. And it is out of that process that new outcomes and important new products, new activities will come. So there's a great constraint in the ability of people to move throughout the region.
I mean, before I go to Anki Scott Joseph, who's monitoring all the activity going on online and make a contribution with the discussion, let me ask Wendell. The question I have for you, Wendell, when you talked about putting ferries in place across this region, we've talked about that now for decades. Is it realistic, or do you think this is the time when it will really get pushed?
I think this is the time when it should really get pushed. So the way I see things happening is that I see no reason why that we cannot have a situation where someone produces their agricultural products in St. Vincent and loads it on a truck, he puts it on the ferry, and he drives the ferry off in Barbados, takes it to the supermarket, and sells his product, get back on the ferry at the end of the day, and he's back home. I think that is the sort of things that we have to try to develop in the region to address this issue of food security. As a region, we are net importers of food, significant net importers of food, and we need to address that. The other issue is the point that the last point that Dylan was trying to make regarding the way in which the digital economy can work across countries. And I think that is probably going to be the biggest boost to regional integration, because then we can have young bright kids across the region collaborating on creating apps to to be sold to the rest of the world. And that is how we do it, by creating a digital economy that spans across the entire region.
All right, thanks, Wendell. Well, if we're looking for an example of ferries at work, we're going to the right place, to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's where Ankie Scott Joseph is. She's monitoring things online, but I can tell you, having Grenadines, they have an example that could be easily followed. Am I correct, Ankie?
That's right, Julian, that's right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Almost all of us have been forced to rethink both our individual and collective priorities. And Julian, some of those priority areas were mentioned on Facebook. For example, health and nutrition, education, job and food security, digital transformation, and regional integration. There are some concerns about government fiscal packages. Are they sufficient to jumpstart the economy? And specifically, have they been justly designed to ensure the right priority areas and the right sectors are targeted? There are also deep-rooted concerns being highlighted on Facebook about whether or not now is the right time to re-engage this discussion on Caribbean unity, especially because we are now in the phase where we are now closer to being a global economy. Julian, one important lesson was drawn from tonight's Facebook discussion, and that is critical to this economic transformation process is our people and is our social sector. Many are of the view that protecting, securing, investing, and developing our human resources, our human capital is important because we have now transitioned into a social distancing economy. So although we may have all these policies implemented, if we do not have buy-in by the society, buy-in by our citizens and our investors, if they don't have confidence that our policies are going to work, then our economy will not grow as we would like it to grow. So my suggestion is that we need to consider and place high on the priority list the social sector issues. Now, I want to draw Dylan's attention here. Dylan, during the COVID-19, we would have seen a new category of careers that were emerging under the essential sector, essential services sector. For example, temperature checkers, contract chasers, etc. I think now is the opportune time for us to see a new sector emerging, and one that was highlighted from the Facebook discussion. That is one that allows us as people to be the center of policy change. And so I think it's high time that when we are designing our policies, we need to think about how would they impact on people. So we need to think about now creating a sector that focuses on citizens' participation. How do we change their mindset so they understand that these policies are designed to help to get the economy where it needs to be? Because at the same time, if we have these policies in place, we open up our shows, we said investors come in, and they still are not confident that it is safe, then they would not come to our shows. So Dylan, I want to get your viewpoint on the use of technology and specifically the gaming industry, which is not particularly favored or very popular in the Caribbean. What do you think about the use of gamification, or what is called game science, to help us design policies, to help us to get persons or the social sector view? Let me give a quick example of what I mean by gamification. In Taiwan, every tax receipt and invoice is automatically placed into a lottery that allows citizens to get a chance to win the lottery. And this forces businesses to place these receipts or these transactions on the book. And we've seen that they have at least 74% reduction in tax evasion. In Australia, the government wanted to stimulate or to create an awareness of how census data was used. And so they built a game using real census data to allow the citizens to understand and to make suggestions on how the economy could work. So what do you think about this idea, Peter? I want to draw at this time Dylan's attention. Now, Dylan, unfortunately, Our greatest resource is our greatest threat, our people. What do you think can be done to help the government to build stronger relationships so that investors now have confidence that the decisions that government make, these policy decisions that we're putting forward tonight, are actually effective? Now, I want to turn to Dr. Samuel. Dr. Samuel, yes, we spoke about foreign direct investment. And one thing is very important is that governments need to learn from what works. They need to look at lessons learned, etc. But what is critical for this is data. Data is critical for this. So my question to you is, Dr. Samuel, what do you think about us considering open data and big data as a risk management tool for governments to use going forward when they're trying to design their policies? And also, remember back in the 1980s and 1990s when we had the financial offshore services that was booming? What do you think about now? We consider big data, offshore financial services as an innovative way to help us to reignite this FDI mission that we are on. Julian, I'm going to wrap up here, but before I wrap up, I want to remind us of this one important thing that came out of Facebook. Our people, just as important as the vaccines, as the ventilators, so too is data. Data is just as critical as hand sanitizers. I now step back and allow the panel to air their views. Have a good night, everyone.
Well, let me say that the use of modern tools and modern techniques are what we must encourage. But we have to start with a structural problem. Large numbers of our people are not interconnected. And so there needs to be a broadband strategy across the Caribbean. I know there's been talk about that, rolled out in every household, and there are universal service funds that could support such a strategy. So you have to begin with that interconnection. We have a large number of people in the so-called informal sector, so that in a real way, many of these technologies and strategies can't be effective because large numbers of people are outside of the digital world, so to speak, the so-called digital divide. So that has to be bridged, and it has to be bridged quickly. And in some countries, there are actually resources. And these technologies, by the way, have to be fashioned for those who have disabilities and those persons who have special needs. It's not just the average citizen, right? So that we can be truly inclusive.
Lovely. I can hear you. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Please
Hi.
continue.
Oh, yeah, sure. I just wanted to pick up again on this question of regional integration. I really think that, transportation is a first step, and we should certainly think a lot about, like what are some of the services and goods that we can trade with each other first, right? I think, the issue of moving people across space becomes really complicated because there are a whole host of like legal and socio-political issues that we have to think about and that we have to really deal with. And the university system, again, I want to reiterate, has been a huge success in the sense that, my mom went to the University of the West Indies in the 1970s, and there she met people from all across the region. Ralph Gonsalves, who's a prime minister in the region, he was one of her classmates. And so I think that education is a great place to start. And it's certainly like a huge area that we import education a lot from the United States. So we need to think about, are there ways that we can begin to cross-educate our people within the region and kind of make these initial steps towards, bringing our countries closer together without thinking about doing something that's as dramatic as like the free movement of labor across space. Because I think, looking at the issues that the US faces with immigration from a political standpoint, it's the kind of thing that if done poorly could really create a lot of backlash.
Thanks, Peter. Definitely, we need to be considering what are some of the issues in the Caribbean for which we need to redesign our education sector. I'll now turn to Dr. Samuel. Dr. Samuel, what are your views on some of the immediate solutions going forward?
So I want to end where I started, and basically my point at the beginning is that investment is critical, and the investment should take place. I suggested in three broad areas. One is in agriculture. The second is in infrastructure for the digital economy, and the third for investing in renewable energy. In the short, so the question is, in the short run, how do we undertake that investment? And the first way to do that is on the budget. So the budget offers us a choice between transfers and investment. Government would have to make transfers in order to keep people employed, or invest. I think it's better to create the employment or create the income on the investment side. So you create domestic investment that create jobs, that generates income, and that then can be used. The other issue, so how we do that then? Then you have to mobilize domestic resources. In this current situation, tax is not really possible. So it means that we have to tap significant liquidity that exists in the banking system. We have to find ways to mobilize our domestic resources. And countries can undertake IMF programs where necessary as an option. Over the medium term, the issue of deepening regional integration is important, and that will require reducing trade restrictions, address regional transport, and develop a single market for telecommunications, which then opens up a regional market, a regional space in which our young people can dream and create employment opportunities and products for international trade. We also have to, as a region, and maybe even beyond the region, try to mobilize green financing. We have to engage the entire region, and even among small states in efforts to reform how green financing is provided to countries. In the long run, we are all dead, as Keen said. But I hope that the next generation would embrace a green, resilient economy, and also achieve greater regional integration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel. I want to quickly re-engage Peter. Peter, can you please share your views on the question regarding using the gaming industry, using gamification, using digital transformation to design policies to get people to change their mindset about the outcome of policies? I want to re-engage you right here, Peter.
Yeah, so certainly, Anki, I think that there is a role for thinking about digitization and gamification in terms of like easing the way that transactions happen in the market and facilitating that. At the end of the day, people are going to be the ones that are going to be using these systems. And so unless we fundamentally build really strong, resilient people, and we build an economy that really centers the people of our countries, we can add all of the technology and all of the frills that we want to add, and it will still come to naught. That's my view. I want to touch on one other quick thing that I've done some research on in my PhD thesis, which is looking at the role of foreign direct investment on economic growth. In this particular moment, foreign direct investment has dried up, tourism has dried up. And one of the things that I see from my research was that in the context of the Bahamas, comparing it with Barbados, we have a lot more foreign direct investment, but we don't have a lot more growth. And so this is something that's really instructive, that the solutions that we're looking for in this COVID moment are not going to come from without. It's not going to come from the US or from China or from somebody bringing money into our country. It's really going to come from us taking this time when we have this great pause to say, okay, who are we as a nation? What are we about? What are the resources that we have? How are we developing our people? And how are we creating an economic, legislative environment whereby our own people can invest in our economy, whether they're at home or in the diaspora, and really together we can build a really strong economic system. My research shows that this is really a critical part of the development process, and I think the exigent circumstances of COVID-19 really gives us an opportunity to reset, to restart, and to try to work from within to really build a strong economy.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I'm going to allow you guys now to share some final thoughts. But before we do that, I want to engage Dylan. Dylan, what are your views on what we can do to build confidence in our citizens that the policy decisions put forward by government would help to reignite this economy? And in so doing, I want you to give your final thoughts. You have a minute and a half, Dylan.
Well, let me talk to what I think is possible. We, as I say, there's a global process afoot, and we hope that we will get liquidity. We have a debt problem, and ECLAC has proposed a debt for climate adaptation swap initiative and a Caribbean Resilience Fund as ways for bringing long-term, low-cost finance in the region. And we have to find a way of incentivizing our private sector. But at the end of the day, my point remains, you have to invest in domestic capability for global export services. And that will create for our people decent jobs, and that will be a resilient strategy. And let me tell you something about the education system, which some people glorify. Only 40% of the students who write the CXC, only 40% of the cohort eligible to write the CXC write it. And of that, 62% get 2 subjects or less. This is an education system that has failed us. And you can't build domestic capability to address climate change, natural disasters, deal with our ocean, if you don't change that structure of education. And remove also the common entrance. And I'm glad that the Barbados Prime Minister has raised this point. But the important thing is what you replace it with. You replace it with individual evaluation of students, and you replace it with raising the quality of students across the board for a globally competitive education system. And that in the end will create a resilient Caribbean.
Thanks very much, Dylan. Julian, it's back to you.
I think Julian is still not here, so I think Eric should go ahead.
All right, some final thoughts, Eric. What are your final thoughts?
Okay, let me touch, because a lot of the other things have already been touched upon, and I agree with most of them, on 2 things. I mean, one, that's more my area of expertise, the environment. I think this is a real opportunity to really look at this situation, a little bit of the breather. I mean, the tourism industry is at least going to be awash for the next season, and think about, and even agriculture in this sense, what are the sort of long-term views? And one of the factors that there's a lot of discussion about, and there's some action already, is of course the environment. We know that climate is changing. How much or how little, of course, there's a lot of disagreement about, but we know certainly there's going to be some sea level rise. Regardless if one focuses on the tourism industry or just in general, that's going to have implications. Hurricane activity is going to change. At least there's going to be more powerful storms, maybe not necessarily more in this regard. So we're going to be more exposed to those. And I think There has to be a sort of general long-term strategy. And I don't really like the word long-term, because long-term is really talking about, long-term implications. All strategies should really be short-term and start implementing them now. But there has to be a long-term strategy on how Caribbean economies are going to deal with this changing environment. And it's not just in terms of the supply of how the environment is changing, it's also the demand. So I think the demand for cleaner, greener products is going to change. So I think there has to be a general sort of region-wide strategy on what to do about this. This means greening the economy, focusing on renewable energies rather than importing fossil fuel products and all these sort of things. And the second, somewhat smaller thing is in terms of integration, which I find a fascinating topic, and I think being a German, I think I have at least a unique view on this as part of the European Union. And one of the things is, the first thing to know is that the European Union is something that's been in the process for 60 years, so it's not something you can enforce quickly. And at least my view of the European Union is part of the reason that it's at least partially successful is that it's based on economic integration during good times, so that people realize during crisis times, like during the Brexit issue, and even now that the economies realize, well, even though one is kind of thinking about national interest, in the end we're all better off, because economic integration has benefited everybody in terms of migration, in terms of trade, and regional-wide initiatives in this regard.
Thanks very much, Eric, for your intervention. Thanks very much, panel, for your intervention. We definitely have a mouthful of strategies to think about going forward as we try to reignite our Caribbean economies. We're going to rethink Caribbean unity. We're going to rethink digital transformation, agriculture, and also what efforts we need in terms of climate change. Viewers, thanks again for joining us for the Caribbean Economic Forum, the September edition. Tonight, we looked at adjusting the post-COVID-19 economy. Keep watching CEF, Central Bank of Barbados' production. Good evening, everyone.